So welcome back to the course in a new format. Now we left off, we did section 4.4 last, which was a little while ago, I know, but we looked at all of the different trig functions and their ratios and whatnot. So now we get into the fun stuff, which is looking at the graphs of sine and cosine. The other ones we're not going to look at, unfortunately, but these ones will give you at least a little bit of a taste of how you can look at the graphs pretty easily and transform them using our standard transformations. First thing though, let's get a sense of what they look like. So I set up some tables here to kind of look at some key x values, just going from 0 to 2 pi because that's the typical period of sine and cosine, and then some of their respective values. So if we fill in here pretty quickly, sine of 0 should be 0. Sine of pi over 3, that's going to be 1/2. Sine of pi over 4, square root of 2 over 2. Sine of pi over 2 is going to be equal to 1. 5 pi over 6, I believe, is going to be 1/2. Sine of pi is 0. 7 pi over 6 is going to be negative 1/2. And this should be negative 1. This is going to be negative 1/2. And this will be 0. So that takes care of sine. And then if we look at cosine, so cosine of 0 is 1. Pi over 6, cosine of that would be square root of 3 over 2. Cosine of pi over 4, square root of 2 over 2. Cosine of pi would be 0. 5 pi over 6, that's going to be negative square root of 3 over 2. Cosine of pi would be negative 1. 7 pi over 6 would be negative square root of 3 over 2. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 would be 0. This is going to be positive square root of 3 over 2. And then it's back to 1. Okay, so now that we have all of our values for each of those identified, we can put them into our graph. So if we look at y equal to the sine of x first, then we just plot our points. So 0, 0 is going to be the starting point. Pi over 6, we said it was equal to 1/2, so right about there. Now pi over 4 is going to have to be about halfway between. I didn't draw that in. Pi over 4 is going to have to be halfway between pi over 2 and pi over 4. Now square root of 2 over 2 is approximately equal to 0.707. So a little under 3/4. Pi over 2 should be equal to 1. And then it goes to 5 pi over 6, so that's 1/2 again. Then it drops down to 0. 7 pi over 6 is going to be about negative 1/2. And then it drops all the way down to negative 1. Back up to negative 1/2. And then back to 1. So that should be our graph. So if we kind of put our curve through it, so we got, should be a nice smooth curve through that. Now we're going to see that there's going to be a quicker way to draw this on the next page, but for now, just have a sense that it's kind of like an S curve for sine. Cosine, on the other hand, so now we're starting at 1 when x is equal to 0. So we're going to be all the way up here. Now square root of 3 over 2 is approximately equal to 0.8 7. So it's up there a bit. So I'm going to put it right about there. Pi over 2, remember, pi over 4 would be here, and that's still going to be about 3/4. So there's a half. So right about there. Pi over 2, it drops down to 0. 5 pi over 6, remember, was negative square root of 3 over 2. So now we're below. So that's pretty large on the negative side. Drops down to -1. And then it starts to come back up again. So we can kind of see it does another smooth transition through there. So if we kind of carefully sketch, you should get something that looks like that. So cosine will be kind of a U shape. So sine is always an S shape, cosine is always a U shape. So that's kind of what we're going to be dealing with. And now in the next video, we'll see how we can simplify it down so it's a lot faster to draw these. Stay tuned.